Hello, my name is Bree Talbot. I'm the VAWA Program Coordinator for the Utah Office for Victims of Crime. And in this video, we're going to be doing an overview of VAWA funding for the 2025 through 2027 RFP. We'll include award information, program plan information, and file submission in this video. The state of Utah receives a formula grant from the Office on Violence Against Women, also known as OVW. The funding we receive includes STOP funding, which is the federal designation for these funds, but we just call them VAWA funds here. VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, which was signed in 1994. This legislative packet is designed to improve criminal justice responses to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and recently female genital mutilation was added to that. The STOP program is designed to support law enforcement, prosecution, courts, and victim services efforts to increase victim safety and hold offenders accountable for these crimes. This funding has 5 allocation categories that are required by OVW. You can see on the chart the courts allocation receives 5% of the funding. Prosecution and law enforcement each receive 25%. Victim services receives 30%. And there's a discretionary distribution that receives 15%. The discretionary distribution is meant to enhance any of these allocations or support federal purpose areas that do not fit within these categories. As you can see on this slide, there's $4 million in funding available for this RFP, which is to be distributed over 2 years. A couple of things to note additionally, within the victim services allocation, there's a 10% set aside to culturally specific organizations. There's also a sexual assault set aside, which is 20% of the overall award. We'll go into both of these set asides next. As mentioned, VAWA does have a sexual assault specific set aside, and 20% of this total funding will go to those applications. VAWA is very clear in its statute that sexual assault programs under this category must have a specific, legitimate focus on sexual assault, and that programs provide direct services. There's a list of potential programs here, certainly not an exhaustive list, but it will give you a few examples. One thing to note, projects regarding sex trafficking are also allowable. However, the services provided specifically on the project must be related to sexual assault and not addressing trafficking as a whole. Because VAWA allows for such diverse sexual assault projects, agencies must acknowledge that their program is meaningful and victim-centered. This is done on the sexual assault set-aside compliance form. This document will be reviewed in the forms section. If your agency wants to apply for the sexual assault set-aside funding, you must submit an application dedicated solely to sexual assault. For example, if you're applying for both domestic violence and sexual assault funding, you need to submit 2 separate applications, one for each funding category. Culturally specific set-aside is for nonprofit, non-governmental, or tribal organizations that serve racial and ethnic minorities. Agencies applying for these funds should be by and for the populations they're serving. As you can see on the slide, racial and ethnic minorities are defined as Native Americans, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, Blacks, and Hispanics. Applicants for this set-aside must do the following: focus on the 5 crime categories, have an established, specialized, culturally specific program that addresses the 5 crime categories, have a primary focus on underserved populations, have expertise or show demonstrated capacity to work effectively through collaboration, and are directed toward racial and ethnic groups, and are providing services tailored to the unique needs of that population. If you intend to apply under this set-aside, it's important to describe how you're addressing these points in your application. So who's available for this funding source? Applicants must be state or local governments, tribal entities, or nonprofit, rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, or faith-based or community-based victim services organizations. You can see here some more information on the categories and who would fall under which categories. For courts, allocations must be made to the courts, so that would include any civil, criminal, or tribal court that addresses one of the 5 VAWA-eligible crimes. Law enforcement is a public agency charged with policing functions, again, specifically working on VAWA-eligible cases. Prosecution agencies are public agencies charged with the direct responsibility for prosecuting criminal offenders and of eligible crimes. Victim services are nonprofit, non-governmental organizations providing services to victims of VAWA eligible crimes. VAWA does have a match requirement of 25% for awards made to courts, law enforcement, and prosecution. Tribal and nonprofit, non-governmental organizations are exempt, but can voluntarily provide match. With match, a main focus is that the match must also be VAWA eligible. For example, you couldn't use a position that doesn't provide VAWA eligible services as a match. The budget considerations for VAWA funding are very similar to what was reviewed in the budget and funding module. But to review these funding considerations, you can go to the VAWA applications instructions document. As you can see on this slide, there are some examples of allowable and unallowable elements with VAWA. This list is brief. You can find a more exhaustive list on the UOVC website, which is at the bottom of this slide. It's important to be familiar with what is allowable and unallowable when you apply for VAWA. To help with your application, we've created a few tools for you, including the VAWA Companion Guide, VAWA Funding Instructions Packet, Federal Application Instruction videos, and the UOVC website. It's important that you watch all of the federal training modules prior to applying for your VAWA grant, because there have been multiple changes to the application this year. The Companion Guide is meant to be a resource for you throughout the grant period and includes information on reporting, submitting information, and other VAWA-specific information. The instructions packet provides information on the application itself, including steps for applying, information on questions on the application, and the application requirements. All of these resources and additional information can be found at the website on the screen, which is the UOVC website. Next, we're going to discuss the VAWA program plan. The process for this is new this year, so please submit any questions related to this on the Q&A submission form. With VAWA, there are 4 federal priorities. These priorities align with the implementation plan goals. The federal priorities are to promote equity and respectable tribal sovereignty, to better serve survivors from marginalized communities, especially those facing high rates of violence and barriers to health, to improve justice for all survivors, focusing on criminal justice reforms that center on survivors' needs, to strengthen efforts to prevent and respond to sexual assault, including through victim support and legal responses, and to expand survivor-focused support and advocacy initiatives to promote safety and prevent violence. If you're not familiar with VAWA, you may not know what the implementation plan is. It's essentially a plan that has been created with stakeholders across the state to identify gaps and barriers in services to victims and how we plan to utilize VAWA funding to bridge those gaps. We've created a document, which is linked here, that has just the implementation plan goals, as well as, and this is also in the application portion of the GMS. If you'd like to review the entire plan, you can visit the UOVC website under the VAWA funding/implementation plan tab in the general grants section. All VAWA applications will need to include a section after the statement of problem and need. These are the 2 questions that will be on the application. We would like applicants to describe how their project aligns with the implementation plan goals and objectives. It's helpful to reference and describe how your plan or how your work aligns with them. If your project doesn't address any implementation plan goals, you must explain why. Stop VAWA has 24 program purposes, and each application must support at least one of these areas. Please make sure you review the program purposes and understand them before selecting the purposes that are applicable to your program. The program purposes are included in the required VAWA information form, and that's where you'll select which areas are applicable to your program. This is a new form this year, and all applicants must complete the required VAWA information form if you're applying for VAWA. This will serve as your program plan for the grant cycle and will be reported on twice per year. It mirrors the VAWA annual report that's submitted to OVW. We are going to open the form and look at it. So on the first tab, you'll see is the instructions tab. This tab has information on the different sections and requirements. Each agency is required to complete the program purposes, CC and CCR tabs, as well as at least one additional tab based on your program's focus and funding request. There's some information on the instructions tab related to what additional tab or tabs you'll need to complete. Something that may be helpful is to look at the positions you're requesting funding for and what they're doing. So if you're requesting a prosecutor position, you'll complete the prosecution tab as your additional tab. If you're requesting an investigator position, you'll complete the case investigation tab. If you're requesting a victim advocate, you'll complete the victim services tab. And if you're requesting multiple types of positions, then you'll be required to complete more tabs based on their roles. The next tab is the program purposes tab. This is where you'll select which of the 24 program purposes your program will address with this award application. You'll want to make sure through this whole document that you're only reporting on information that'll be funded by this award. For example, number 2 here is training law enforcement, judges, court personnel, and prosecutors on VAWA crimes. Your program may do this under another funding source, but if it's not something that you intend to do with the funds requested in this application, then that box should not be checked. After that, we have the CCR, or Coordinated Community Response tab. Your certification of consultation and coordination will come in handy when you fill out this tab. This is a requirement of the VAWA annual report, which is why it's also included in the required VAWA information. For this tab, you'll check all applicable CCR partners and describe your planned activities for coordination during the 2025 through 2027 grant cycle. You're welcome to do a project if you would like, but that is not a requirement this year. Following tabs all have a checkbox at the top of them. If the tab is not applicable to your application, please check the box so our reviewers know. You'll notice in all of these tabs that if there's a quantitative goal, it will automatically sum in the yellow section over here. There will also be grayed out boxes. These don't have to be complete. You will need to complete both the purple and the blue columns and check that the yellow column has any required narratives completed. So the general tab is for training, community education, and public awareness, policies and legislation, and products. You'll need project goals for each of You'll need to project goals, for each year of the upcoming cycles. So you'll do year 1 in the purple section and year 2 in the blue section. And then you'll need to tie it back to the implementation plan, program purposes, and or federal priorities. The next tab is the victim services tab. The information in this tab is reduced quite a bit from the federal report requirements. So the semi-annual reporting will have some additional information to report on, but when you're doing this form, this is the only information you need to provide. Similar to the last tab, you'll project goals for the different victimization types, services, and protective orders down at the bottom. The quantitative numbers from the purple and blue sections will auto sum into the yellow section. And you'll see in the yellow section that there's a narrative box to describe how STOP funds will be used to support survivors. This is a great place to connect back to the implementation plan, program purposes, and federal priorities. You'll notice that we're going to connect back to those three things pretty often through this. The information in each of these tabs is going to be slightly different, but each tab does have a narrative box to talk about how funds will be used to support victims. When you complete these, make sure they tie back to at least one of those three elements. So you can see here, we have legal services next. Agencies who provide legal services to victims of crime will complete this section. You'll see at the bottom here, we have a box for a narrative. Next, we have case investigation. This tab is for applicants who have detectives or investigators to be funded, again with a narrative box. Next is prosecution. This is for applicants who will request to have specialized prosecutors to be funded. And finally, we have the courts tab, which is for any court entity that is applying for funding. As a reminder, all information put into this form should be based directly on the funding being requested, not necessarily your program as a whole. When you've completed this form, you'll save it and attach it to the files section of your application. Next, we're going to review VAWA required files. So as you can see here, there's a list of files that are required for all applicants and a list of files that may or may not be applicable based on your application. These are found in the VAWA instructions packet as well. The VAWA required information was reviewed previously, but we'll go over all of these other files next. Files can be uploaded into the application itself, or certain files can be uploaded into your agency's profile, which is a new option this year. Documents that don't commonly change between funding cycles or apply to multiple funding requests can be uploaded into your agency's profile. These typically include policies, 501c3 documents, W-9s, rosters of governing board, and organizational charts. You can upload them into your agency's profile by clicking on this account information icon, which is in the top right-hand corner of the main page of the GMS after you log in. Then you'll click on the Related tab and upload your files. All other files will need to be directly uploaded into your application. New required document this year is the pre-screen questionnaire. You'll need to download the VAWA pre-screen questionnaire, then answer the questions based on your agency's current practices. Any questions that you answer no to will need a clear justification in the narrative box at the bottom. All agencies are required to upload a verification of an active SAM account. This can be done by going to sam.gov, clicking on Actions, and then downloading that as a PDF. You'll also need to upload job descriptions for each funded position, whether it be federally funded or match. These should be current and include position title, key responsibilities, and qualifications. Another new form this year is the agency budget tracking form. To complete this form, you'll need to provide information for the total dollar amount of each applicable funding source received by your agency. So you'll see federal funds, state funds, private funds, donation funds, any other funds. You'll then need to describe what steps you've taken to diversify the resources within your agency budget. So that'll be a narrative box down here. Organizational chart is also required. This chart should outline the hierarchy of your agency structure and include all grant-funded positions in it. It's preferable that this fits onto one page also. Next, agencies will include a letter of coordination with 3 partnering agencies, and you'll describe how you'll work together to strengthen victim services within your community. You'll then include how often you plan to collaborate and the roles of each participant. Great partnerships will include nonprofit, non-government, otherwise known as community-based, and governmental, known as systems-based agencies working together. You'll need to get signatures for your collaborating partners for this form, so it's important to start this early. For returning agencies, the record of providing effective services can be uploaded, can be an upload of progress reports from the past year. There are instructions on how to save a status report in the VAWA instructions packet. New agencies will include examples such as milestones, the number of clients served, services delivered, program evaluations, etc. New nonprofits will need to upload their 501c3 documents. All nonprofits are required to upload a current roster of their governing board. This should include a list of all board members, their full names and titles or roles, as well as contact information. Please keep this up to date throughout your grant cycle. It's important to note that separating the role of executive director and board president preserves effective internal controls. So we really encourage that practice. If you're requesting funding for travel or emergency funds or direct aid, you will need to submit your agency's policy for those. If you're using office space or vehicle as a match, you'll need to submit documentation supporting the fair market value of that resource. For office space, this would be a detailed estimate of fair market value supported by rental comparisons, lease agreements, appraisals, etc. Vehicle documentation would include evaluation based on fair market value using resources like Kelley Blue Book, Edmunds, or a recent bill of sale. Any agencies requesting contracted fees will be required to submit current contracts that are in place. And if a contract's not currently in place, you may submit this later in the award year. If you have a sample of a contract that you intend to use, that can be submitted as well. But no contracted fees will be paid out prior to having an active contract. As mentioned previously, if you're applying for the sexual assault set-aside, this form will be a requirement. In this form, you'll certify that your agency provides intentional and victim-centered services dedicated to rape and sexual assault victims. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the best during this RFP. If you have additional questions, please submit them to the Q&A form.